We're going to want to mark where our drive key location is going to be. It's got to be 4 inches to 6 inches away from the inside of this vertical frame. So we're going to just mark a spot on the shaft flush with that, and we're going to come across 4 inches, 6 inches, and that's going to be a 5/16 keyway you're going to need to machine in that shaft. Quite often this pulley and this bearing are seized to the shaft. You're going to want to take some emery cloth, remove any rust off the shaft, and spray some penetrating oil in there. Let that soak in. First I'm going to undo this belt tensioner. I'm just going to go ahead and remove that right out of the way. I'm going to set that aside. We'll undo that belt. Make sure we leave it hanging there. We're going to rotate this so we have position A lined up. That's going to have our knife in the mid-stroke position so that we can put it all back together without any difficult alignment. Remove the PTO shaft, set it aside. Take some tension off the belt. There's 2 set screws on this pulley, and it is a sintered metal pulley, so you want to be gentle with it. Make sure you're not going to be hammering on it. There's also two set screws that locate this bearing. Well, just take a punch. Make sure that they're unseized from the shaft. Never hammer on the drive surface of the sheave. And as I say, this is a very delicate pulley, so you want to use very light taps. You want to remove the drive key and clean up any marks from the set screws on that shaft. The next step is to remove the 3 bearing supports from the frame. This one we're going to go ahead, loosen off the bearings completely. When removing these bearing support bolts, what I like to do is remove the bearing support very gently, slip the nuts back on, and then before I go to reinstall, I take an elastic and slip it around the bolt, and this will prevent them from being pushed back in accidentally. Gives it a little tension there, makes reassembly much easier because they are very difficult to get into place there. This end of the shaft is supported by the shaft coupler here. I've gone ahead and I've taken out the shear bolt out of the knife drive coupler, and then I've put some support underneath this shaft because it gets quite awkward and heavy with this gearbox. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take these 2 bearings off. The first thing I'm going to do is fully loosen this bearing to allow this bearing support some flexibility. Before I remove the nuts, give that a wiggle, make sure it's loose. I'm going to very carefully remove these nuts so that these bolts do not fall back into the frame. Swing that out of the way and replace my nuts back on the bolts for safekeeping. This final bearing, we're not going to loosen the bearing on the shaft, and it is going to have the weight of this gearbox. Make sure you have a proper lifting device or a second person to support that shaft. Also, this bracket needs to go back on. Make sure you leave that handy so that you know, as a reminder, that you're going to need that. We're going to move these items. I'm going to set them on here in order. So that we know what order they need to go back on the shaft in. Then we're going to get a keyway cut at our local machine shop. Now that we have our keyway cut, we want to make sure our shaft is clean of burrs and nicks and rust. We're going to start with our ABS plastic shaft guard, lock collar and bearing assembly, and slide that right on down. Then we're going to install our drive key, followed by our E bushing. We're going to install this with the flange towards the combine. We're going to install it so that we're just flush to the edge of the keyway, so that we're 6 inches from this surface. We're going to tighten that set screw. We want to make sure that this tapered surface on the bushing and on the pulley is completely dry. No oil, no grease, no anti-seize. We want a dry fit on there. Slide it over and into place. We're going to install our bolts from the bushing side through the holes and through into the tapped holes in the pulley. We're going to run those up just snug. Then we're going to take our torque wrench. We're going to set it to 40 foot-pounds. We're going to torque those bolts in small increments. We're going to go around 2 or 3 times once we're to torque. Make sure that we have a nice even pull on that bushing. And we're going to follow that up. We're going to slip our belt over our shaft, followed by our second bearing with the lock collar towards the outside end of the header. Next, we're going to reassemble all the original items back onto the shaft before we fasten the shaft back into place. Bearing support, bearing flange, original bearing, we don't want to forget about this drive belt, and the knife drive coupler goes on with the shear bolt lined up with a drive key for the canvas drive. Now that you have everything assembled back onto the shaft, you're going to want to fit this back into place. We've got our bolts held in place by our elastic. Carefully want to remove our nuts and fit our bearing support back into place. We're going to want to get that in place and then install this bearing support, and finally the last one, before we tighten anything up. You're going to assemble the bearing back into place. Make sure our bearing and shaft are lined up before we tighten up any of the mounting hardware. Before we tighten any of our bearing support brackets, we're going to want to reinstall our knife drive shear bolt to ensure that our shaft is properly aligned to avoid spline wear here in the future. And we're going to start with the bearing support at the gear case and work our way towards the outside of the head. And then we're going to go ahead and tighten these 2 bolts. And then we're going to go ahead and want to snug everything up and then tighten the bolts for the bearing support first. Followed by the bearing flange bolts. And finally, we're going to do this bearing. Before we slide this pulley into place, we're just going to lock our bearing in with the 2 set screws. Going to install our drive key. Line up our pulleys and lock them in place using the 2 set screws. I always recommend giving a bare shaft like this a light dusting of paint. Paint is much easier to remove than rust. Once we have the shaft back in place, we're going to slip our gearbox drive back on. We're going to put the belt on, then install the tensioner pin. Going to cinch our cotter pin and adjust our belt tension, our center conveyor drive. And lock it in place with the gem nut.